The pause screen camera in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is incredibly impressive, allowing you to see more of each stage than you'd ever see during normal gameplay. Now, we've already made a couple of videos showing off some pretty cool secrets hidden off-screen that you were meant to find, but the camera is so powerful that it also allows you to see quite a few things that the developers never intended for you to find. And that's even more the case when you combine it with the ability to advance the game frame by frame. So join us as we use the camera to explore 10 stages and uncover some of the tricks and visual shortcuts the developers took when it came to creating these environments. So let's get to it. Like Breath of the Wild itself, the Great Plateau Tower stage is breathtaking, offering an amazing view of not just the Great Plateau itself, but the entire world. It is truly impressive that the Switch can pull this off at 60 frames per second when that's something that even Breath of the Wild couldn't. But as it turns out, that's all for a very good reason, because this is mostly an illusion. While the tower itself and some of the Great Plateau that we can see actually do exist in 3 dimensions, the entire backdrop doesn't. It's simply an image layered onto a skybox. You can easily tell it's an image by zooming in all the way, which exposes the telltale compression artifacts. But from a distance, it looks pretty much perfect, especially with how the Great Plateau's walls inherently act as the perfect divider. And that illusion is enhanced even farther by some clever animation taking place in the background, like shimmering bodies of water, smoke from campfires, the fire from Death Mountain, the dark energy surrounding Hyrule Castle, and the fog rolling through the world. And speaking of fog, it's incredibly clever how they use clouds at the base of the Great Plateau in order to conceal the exact separation point between the Great Plateau and the rest of the world in the background. But there is one point of separation that isn't quite as effective, even if it's still extremely impressive. Especially when you consider it's for an area entirely off-screen, and that you would only ever see when using the pause screen camera. So if we rotate the camera to the left, we can see a huge portion of the Great Plateau, including the Shrine of Resurrection way off in the distance, as well as the vast forest of spirits right in front of it. But what if I told you that most of that doesn't actually exist, except as part of the background like most everything else in the world? Can you see what we're talking about? It's tricky, so I'll give you a few seconds. Still can't see it? How about now? The trees here, as well as the area to the left, just slowly fade away. It creates a nearly invisible seam between the 3-dimensional parts of the Great Plateau and the 2-dimensional background. It's pretty much only when we move the camera that the trick is exposed. And even then, it's still pretty darn effective. The Halberd stage has always been one of my favorites, with how it begins in a giant hangar before the Halberd itself springs to life and takes off, as you go on a wild goose chase after it. But have you ever wondered what that hangar looks like from the outside? Well, thanks to Ultimate's camera, you can now see it for yourself. And as it turns out, it looks a lot like a giant hangar, only it's floating out in the middle of nowhere. And oddly, despite taking off, the Halberd shadow continues to exist. But neither it nor the entire hangar stick around for long, because just moments before the Halberd flies past, it vanishes into thin air. Huh, that's just gotta be Meta Knight's new cloaking technology, right? So the Spirit Train stage offers the illusion of riding a train on an endless track around the world. But if we turn the camera just slightly, we can break that illusion real quick. As you can see, the track actually appears in front of the train just a short ways from where it needs to be, almost as if they're being laid down by Spirit themselves. You can also see that it loads independently of the rest of the background, which itself loads in discrete tiles, with entire mountains appearing from thin air. And as you might have guessed, this works the exact same way in reverse too, with the environment disappearing into thin air. And yes, this also applies to the bomb cars too, that appear out of thin air and disappear in the same way. Now throughout the stage, you'll have different objects added to the rear train car, and this normally happens entirely off screen, so you can't see exactly how this works. But if we angle the camera, we can reveal exactly what's going on. And as you probably guessed by now, the objects appear out of thin air. But what's interesting is if you have a character standing there, it actually takes them a few frames to respawn. Such as how Toon Link appears to be standing on a ghost house. You know, the Spirit Train name is making a whole lot more sense now. Now, something else that you may have already noticed is that the rails that the train rides on don't actually extend all the way to the end of the track on either side. And this is for a pretty good reason, because those rails aren't actually part of the environment. And we know this because if we zoom in close enough to see the detail on the rails themselves, we can see that the rails never actually move. Instead, they're effectively connected to the train, traveling along with it at the exact same speed. And the rivets, which are part of the environment, really help sell the illusion. Pretty clever, isn't it? While we're down here, we can see there's a very slight gap between the environment in the foreground and the actual track pieces themselves, through which the background shows through a little bit. Finally, while it might often look like you're passing by a lush forest in the background, turning the camera reveals the truth. And that's the fact that while the trees close to the track are actually three-dimensional, the ones set just a bit farther back are looking a little flat, being portrayed by two-dimensional billboards. And this is a technique used to varying degrees in quite a few stages, including for some pretty prominent objects, like in... Yep, I'm talking about the SS Drake in the Garden of Hope stage. Even though it's not exactly huge, it is prominent, so it was a little surprising to learn that it's no 3D object. Instead, it's another 2D cutout, which you can see by zooming in and panning the camera side to side. But again, it's something you're unlikely to notice during actual gameplay, which just goes to show how clever these tricks can be in the right circumstances. Hey, and while we're here, have you ever wondered what the suspended tin can platforms are hanging from? Well, it took some work, but if we zoom out all the way and rotate the camera, we can see they're not connected to anything. But those ropes do go surprisingly high, don't they? Big Blue works a little bit like Spirit Train, where if you rotate the camera, you can see the track and background objects popping in and popping out as needed. But with it being a big body of water, they all have a neat reflection effect applied. But is it really an effect, or just a clever trick? Well, if we zoom out far enough and position the camera under the water, we can see exactly what's going on. And as it turns out, it's a really simple trick, with each object having an identical second half just flipped upside down. Although in the case of distant objects, that portion is a pre-colored flat black, while the closer elements, like the rocks here, retain their full color. So from above the surface, it offers the convincing illusion of being a reflection. Now speaking of those rocks, there's something else we noticed here too. Keep an eye on the ones closest to the camera on the right. Did you see that? As soon as they get close to the camera, they instantly get squashed down. This is likely done so they don't interfere with the camera as you're racing past them. And speaking of which, Big Blue is obviously all about speed. And to help sell that illusion, the background objects actually pass by faster than they should be. Just look at how much faster the rocks pass by the camera than the track itself does. And this explains why the background objects appear to keep moving in the same direction, even though they should be going the other way when you're racing up the loop, effectively going backwards through the stage for a brief period of time. And speaking of the loop, the camera allows us to get a brand new angle on it. And I never appreciated before just how freaking big it really is. Look at that thing! It towers over everything else. And here's a fun little thing we can do with the camera. We can move it underneath the track for a cool new angle on the loop. New Donk City does a great job of making it feel like you're fighting within a dense metropolitan region. And that's partially because this stage looks so much like the actual level from Super Mario Odyssey, even going so far as to include the building way off to the side here that you can really only see when using the pause screen camera. However, there is one specific moment during this stage that lets you see the exact extent of the illusion, and it comes when the platform returns you from the top of the tower back to the base. And because the camera is facing down toward the ground during this segment, you can use the pause screen camera to see far more than you could at any other point in the stage. And we can see that in this case, what you can see during the match is pretty much what you get. New Donk City? More like New Donk Block. So Tortimer Island doesn't offer a whole lot to find beyond what you can already see normally. Although the camera does allow you to better appreciate the overall curved nature of the world here, which is perhaps a nod to the rolling log effect made famous by the series. But there is one odd thing you can see here. Now, one of the cooler things about this stage is how Captain will occasionally pull up to the island in his boat for a brief stay, before taking off again shortly after. But now, thanks to the new camera, we can follow along in his journey off screen, and we can see that when he takes off, he literally takes off, as he flies above the surface of the water before disappearing. Who would have guessed that his boat is actually a seaplane? Now, this likely happens because, while the level itself is curved, Captain appears to depart in a straight line, meaning that the water level drops beneath him the farther out he goes. Oh, and if you're wondering what that weird dark thing is underneath his boat, well, it's just the boat's reflection, like we saw back in Big Blue. But that doesn't really make it any less weird looking. The living room has to be one of the most adorable stages in gaming history. Aww. And as we already pointed out in our off-screen secrets video, it's also surprisingly detailed. Because while the entire match takes place within a room, you only ever see the floor, ceiling, and the wall ahead. And presumably, there should be a few more walls here. And sure enough, if you pause the game and rotate the camera to the side, you'll find that the left and right walls not only exist, but have a surprising amount going on. Whether it's another view of the garden outside, or an intricate fireplace complete with lit fire. But, for as impressive looking as that fire is, the ability to go frame by frame betrays the illusion, as that fire isn't actually animated at all. It's just a static image, which does make complete sense as you'd ordinarily only see it during freeze frames. Now while we're here, there is one other thing I wanted to point out, because while we can find 3 of the 4 walls a rooms usually have, what about the back wall behind the camera? Does it actually exist? Well, if we zoom out to push a camera as far to the side as we can, it's still not enough to see if the wall's actually there or not. But we do have one more trick up our sleeves, because if we actually tilt the camera, it ends up exposing just a little bit more of the environment. And sure enough, as you can see, there's no back wall at all. Instead, the level just leads into a black void. And this isn't unique to the living room, as there are plenty of other stages that were clearly built to be viewed from every possible angle until you tilt the camera, exposing the exact limit that the developers designed up to. Take Gaur Plain for example, where the giant mechanist looms in the background with its sword held out over the stage. An impressive sight to be sure, but one that's a little less so if you pull back the camera and look up, revealing the exact cutoff point of the sword while the sky itself continues on. Although, even with a busted looking sword, we still wouldn't mess with the guy. Town and City, as the name suggests, takes you on the tour of the town and city. However, while you might make the trip back and forth multiple times throughout a match, it's always from the same boring viewpoint. So what if we try taking the trip from a slightly different perspective? Say with the camera facing toward the ground. Well, doing so reveals the town's dirty little secret. None of the buildings have a back. You can see right into them, a little bit like a facade on a movie set. Huh, that Tom Nook sure is getting cheap these days. Wait a second, is he the one who built the house for the Nintendogs too? And while we're using this angle, we can see the exact point that the spectator platform appears and disappears after dropping away. It's a bit freaky. And there you have it, 10 examples of behind the scenes tricks that you can reveal with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's new camera. But you know what? We're not done yet, so stay tuned for part 2 coming up soon with even more. And with that, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button for tons more on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and everything else Nintendo too.